Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. HGM here, and it's time for another PTS patch note update. Today we're taking a look at update 43, which is going to be hitting the live servers in August and September. If you saw my recent video, I already talked about the update to housing that's coming up, also the update to Infinite Archive. Some pretty powerful new class sets are coming in this update as well. But I was also pretty surprised to see some major class balance changes and some potentially good news if you're playing a Necromancer. So in this video, I want to dive into all the class balance changes, as well as go over some skill changes for Scribing. So let's not waste any more time. Let's get right into the class balance changes, starting with the Arcanist and their Abyssal Impact skill, Cephaliarch's Flail. This morph will no longer gain Execute scaling damage, coming in the latest patch, and the healing now only occurs if the ability damages a target. So that was sort of a little trick you could use. Just cast the ability, even without an enemy getting hit by it, you could get a little healing back. You'll no longer be able to do that moving forward, and it'll also do less damage. But they also updated Tentacular Dread, which is the other morph. So that morph now increases its damage done by 33% per crux consumed, up from 20%. So you potentially have double the damage on Tentacular Dread. Now, there is a comment here. Let's check it out very quickly. So in this patch, we're trying to better align the power between these morphs. Originally, it had more execute scaling, but now they're trying just to split the abilities. Flail remains more of a generic buff that allows you to gain additional effects, while Dread more radically shifts how the ability is utilized. So basically, the way I see this is you have more of the damaging morph, and then you have a utility or a healing morph. I'm actually fine with this. I think it's better for morphs to have different effects and seem like different abilities, so I'm okay with that. And that was it as far as the Arcanist class changes. But then, man, Necromancer actually got some pretty big buffs this patch. I know a lot of you Necro mains out there were definitely waiting for this, and I think you'll be pleasantly surprised by what you're getting here. So the overall theme here is they added major and minor effects to numerous Necromancer abilities to help the class better enfeeble their foes and empower themselves with the taste of death. Pretty cool. The following minions and abilities will now only generate a corpse if their summoner was also in combat. So keep this in mind. This is to reduce the ability to generate ultimate outside of combat. So Sacrificial Bones and Gravelord Sacrifice, Skeletal Mage, Bone Armor, and Spirit Member. You can only get corpses from those abilities while you're in combat now. But now we get to the abilities. So Boneyard, right? This ability and its morphs now also apply a minor vulnerability to enemies inside the area, and the Unnerving Boneyard morph, this ability's minor vulnerability now and major breach now persist on enemies for 4.1 seconds each tick, rather than only while in the area. So you'll be able to get a little bit more uptime, you'll get an extra debuff from this ability, so honestly, this sounds really good. I'm definitely a fan of this change. Now, let's talk about Sacrificial Bones. There was a ton of feedback on this, and they did actually address the feedback. So this ability and the Gravelord Sacrifice morphs now no longer require you to be in combat in order to cast them. So you can get this buff. You can pre-buff it outside of combat. You're good to go with this ability. And then they just fixed an issue where the damage increase did not properly update the tooltip. So that's good to see. I know this was essentially like a buff skill now, and having to wait till combat started was really awkward. You'll be able to pre-buff this, like I said, now to make your rotation a little bit smoother. Now, these next two I'm actually a huge fan of. Shocking Siphon, so this is your tether, like a damage over time. You need a corpse to cast this one. Well, this ability and its morphs now also grant you Major Prophecy and Savagery for 20 seconds after casting. Now, if you weren't aware, that's basically your major crit chance buff, the same buff you get from like potions and Inner Light, for example, Camouflage Hunter. So now you're going to get that just passively on your class when you use this ability. And one more similar buff, Skeletal Mage. This ability and its morphs now also grant you Major Brutality and Major Sorcery for their entire duration. So really interesting update here. The class has never had those skills, basically, those buffs. And now they're just added to, the basic skills that you would run typically on a Necro build. So I think this is really good to see. But that is not all. So let's keep moving on. Bone Tyrant. Bone Armor, this ability and its morphs now also grants Minor Resolve So Major Resolve plus Minor Resolve, that's a ton of resistances. Again, from just one skill, that's really awesome. And if you choose Summoner's Armor, this morph now also lasts 30 seconds, up from 20 seconds. That's pretty good as well. Bone Totem, this ability and its morphs now also apply Major Cowardice to enemies inside. That's a big debuff. They did change the synergy here, so the synergy on Angry Totem no longer applies Minor Vulnerability, since it's you're going to get that from Boneyard now. And then here's a really cool change that I actually like this a lot too. So Ghostly Embrace. This morph now also deals damage equal to half of a normal area effect spammable attack to enemies in each patch. I want to say there's 3 sort of patches or areas of damage for this one. Correct me if I'm wrong. The ability now ranks up in damage per rank. So this is basically now a unique AoE damage skill. Go ahead and read the comment here. So we're adding some additional damage sources outside of Necromancer's Gravelord skill line to help inject some contextual options for damage production without harming their utility. So this won't outweigh purely damage-oriented skills, but with proper aiming and placement, the ability to hit the same enemy with multiple patches allows for some powerful damage scaling. So really interesting. It does kind of remind me of the Sorcerer class mines. If you're familiar with like stacking your mines up and lining them up just right so you get multiple mines to detonate on the same target, this is kind of a similar thing, but with the Necromancer flavor, obviously. So that's a pretty cool change as well. And just a little change here for Spirit Mender, Intensive Mender. This morph now also heals 2 additional allies within 8 meters of the original target. So yeah, huge changes for the Necromancer class. I think this is definitely going to move them in the right direction, but let me know what you guys think down in the comments section below. Now, Nightblade did get some substantial changes as well. Whether these are buffs or nerfs, I'll kind of leave that up to you to decide. It's more of like a restructuring or a reorganizing of the skill line. So this one is definitely interesting too. So they shifted numerous Nightblade abilities to improve their thematic tie into the skill line, while also addressing some long-standing balance issues, particularly in PvP. And this is actually going to tie into the new class set that I talked about in my last video. That new set is not going to be nearly as powerful with these changes in mind, so that's pretty interesting too. So first up, they moved Blur and its morphs out of the Assassination skill line and into the Shadow skill line. So Blur is now the first ability in the Shadow line, taking the place of Veiled Strike. This means Blur and its morphs will now be treated as shadow abilities and interact with augments from the Shadow skill line. So basically the passives are going to work with Blur now instead of Veiled Strike, and obviously that means that Veiled Strike and its morphs are going to be moved out of the Shadow skill line and into the Assassination skill line. This is a massive change for the Nightblade. So Veiled Strike is now the first ability in the Assassination skill line, taking the place of Assassin's Blade. And of course that means that Veiled Strikes and its morphs is now going to be treated as assassination skills. You'll have access to all the assassination passives now. And here it says it, so they moved Assassin's Blade to the open slot that Blur originally occupied as the 3rd ability. So let's go ahead and read the developer comment on this one, because this is a huge change, honestly. We're going through and cleaning up some large inconsistencies with the Nightblade class by reorganizing some abilities that felt out of place, both thematically from their skill line as well as balance. So Blur, an ability that focused on aiding your evasive and tank-like capabilities, is now in the Shadow skill line. Veiled Strike, an ability that focuses on dealing consistent and precise damage, moved to the Assassination skill line. So, I mean, on paper, it actually does make a lot of sense. Having Veiled Strike, especially in the Shadow skill line for so long, was a little strange, being that most of those skills are defensive. And you had like this main spammable attack in the defensive skill line. Now you might be wondering about the Shadow Barrier passive, how you're going to proc that to get your armor buff. On the Nightblade, they did address that as well. So Shadow Barrier, this passive now grants Major Resolve for 12 seconds rather than up to 6. And it now increases by 2 seconds per piece of heavy armor rather than extending the duration by 25% per piece. So my guess is we'll still be able to keep up the Shadow Barrier passive even without Veiled Strike. Probably just one cast of, Twisting Path, something like that is going to be enough to proc that armor buff for your Nightblade. But this does kind of, address that new Nightblade class set that I was talking about in my last video, which seemed super strong You just need to use like a shadow ability to get major vulnerability on your target and dodge the next attack. I was thinking you could just spam surprise attack or veiled strike and get that a big uptime on that set. Well, now it's actually going to be more of a defensive set because you don't have a, like spammable offensive ability in the shadow skill line. So it actually does make a lot more sense when you think about it in that way. So yeah, this is another huge change. I mean, it's not so much balance, but more like organization of the skill line. If you main a Nightblade, definitely let me know what you think about this one in the comment section as well. Like I said, I know this is a huge change for that class. One more too before we move on. So funnel health, this morph now heals up to 3 targets rather than 2. Those of you that have played for a while, I think that's actually what the original ability did back in the day. So yeah, I don't think that's a huge change. Let's move on to Sorcerer. So Daedric summoning, this ability and its morphs now deal their full damage in an area around the cursed enemy, rather than dealing full damage to the enemy and half damage in the area around them. And the damage can no longer be blocked. Something to keep in mind there. And then very interesting here for Daedric Prey, this morph now properly mentions that it also forces your active pets to prioritize the target. I don't think I remember the ability doing that. It seems like it's done that the whole time, I guess. But now it at least mentions it on the tooltip, so that's good. Templar class changes, so Radiant Destruction, they just fixed an issue with the visual here, and then Solar Flare increase the duration of Sun Sphere and Empower to 10 seconds, up from 5 seconds, that's fine. Warden changes, so here's a big one as well. Arctic Blast got balanced. It now functions a little bit differently, so make sure you pay attention to this one. This is a very powerful Warden skill. So Arctic Blast, the morph now instantly deals damage equal to a normal area effect spammable attack rather than healing you instantly. So instead, the healing happens if no targets are affected by the stun. The damage over time now only starts after the 2-second delay rather than instantly as well. They reduce the damage over time by 21% per tick. And they reduce the base chance to apply the chilled status effect to 10% per tick, down from 15. The initial hit has a 25% chance to apply the chilled status. So this seems like a big rework of the ability, and it seems like they're giving you different options of how you want to use it. So now the ability can be used to deal the same total damage over its duration, with more damage focused on the upfront hit, but they're changing the healing to be more conditional rather than a guarantee, and instead creating a situation where the ability can stun foes around you or a delayed and powerful self-heal. So definitely keep that in mind if you're using this ability. The Piercing Cold passive was also reworked, so it's going to give you various effects based on your max health to better align with being a tank or being a DPS. So the passive now grants Piercing Cold for 6 seconds when you deal frost damage. And if you have 30,000 or more max health, it's going to increase the damage you can block by 12%. If you have less than 30,000 max health, it's going to give you up to 8% damage done. Really interesting. Now, in terms of weapon and guild skills, I'm not going to talk about these much. These are basically just updates or bug fixes. Same with Werewolf, but there is a really interesting change for Vampire, especially I think for PvP. So the Undeath passive, this now reduces damage taken by 10% down from 30. That's a huge nerf for Vampire tankiness all around. But they remove the stage 3 or higher requirement of this passive, now that its bonuses are far less potent. And so we can read the developer comment here. So Undeath has had sharp bonuses for a while, incentivizing huge investment into the Vampire. This made it highly potent for players who could work around the trade-offs while simultaneously creating an exclusive bonus that many could not get the value from. So that does seem like a significant nerf. I guess they're just making it more of like a general passive, a little bit of a damage reduction bonus versus this huge sort of kiss curse benefit that you can get at stage 3. Again, that's a big change for Vampire, certainly for PvP builds as well, with that increased survivability. Let me know what you guys think about that one as well in the comments below. Now, if you're curious about scribing, there were some changes, in fact, to most of the grimoires, some of the scripts as well, so we can dive into those next. First of all grimoires have received small increases to focus and signature script interactions. in order to simulate the progression that normal abilities receive as they rank up. So in update 43, basically, that means you'll be seeing some slight increases in things like damage, healing, or shielding by about 3% for focus scripts, which they describe as the base ability or, the main scribed skill, and about 6% for signature scripts, which are sort of like morphs, if you want to think about it like that. They say that hopefully this should help increased scribed abilities to feel more viable when compared to non-scribed abilities in high-end experiences without tipping the scales too much in their favor. Now, I have noticed this as well, where something like a DPS scribed skill or a shield scribed skill is slightly less, in value than like a class ability or a weapon skill, for example. And seeing the gap between those two types of skills, I think, would be pretty nice to make scribing feel like more viable on more builds. So just something to keep in mind. But then we have some specific changes for most of the grimoires, like I said. So for Elemental Explosion, Destruction Staff Scribe skill, they increase all damaging focus script status effect chance to 10% rather than 5%, as this grimoire has a longer commitment, basically cast time. They also reduced the knockback focus to 10 meters down from 12, something to keep that in mind. They increased the Druid's Resurgence signature just slightly up to 470 magicka. And they clarified the War Mage's defense script. So this is like the damage shield part of this skill. The ability grants a much larger damage shield than previously stated, and it now properly mentions its scaling, becoming 20% stronger per hit. And I think this is even more important. They fixed the issue where the damage shield was capped at 50% of your max health, despite the scaling based on the target's hit. So that would almost be like if Brawler had a cap on the damage shield, right? So this skill actually wasn't performing the way it should have previously. It now properly has no cap to its size, similar, like I said, to Brawler. So that is great news, especially for solo builds. If you want to make use of this skill, I think it's a great application. It's a great way to use it. Since it does have that longer cast time, I think it's sort of more of a like utility skill almost than a damage dealing ability. But that's just something to keep in mind. Mentor's Bond, that's the restoration staff skill. They increased the resource focus just slightly there. Increased Druid's Resurgence, again, just a slight uptick there. Same thing with Shield Throw, just a bit of a buff to Druid's Resurgence. Now, the changes to Smash are more, I think, of like a clarification. They did increase Druid's Resurgence here as well, so 200 stamina per tick up from 184. They did increase the healing slightly, which this is good for my Barbarian build, though it's only 2% increase, so I don't really think that'll be too noticeable. But they updated the taunt focus, which I think this is good. It now requires a target to activate rather than being a freely aimed ability. And this just didn't really work because even though it was like an AoE skill, you can still only taunt one enemy at a time in ESO. It's not an AoE taunt. So this adjustment ensures that the enemy you target is now the same target that gets the taunt. So this makes sense. I think it clarifies the skill. Torchbearer got a buff for Druid's Resurgence as well. I think we're seeing that across the board. Little increase of the healing for Traveling Knife. And then fix some issues with the Vault Grimoire. The main one is they increased the heal focus by 55%, since it was healing for the same as a damage focus, but costing more than it should. So I think this is good for the healing version of the skill if you're interested in that type of playstyle. They also buffed Druid's Resurgence as well. I think Wield Soul is really the only skill that got a nerf here. They reduced the Druid's Resurgence signature down to 600 magicka and stamina from 1,000. Now, that was a big buff, 1,000 magicka and stamina every time you cast this, so I think that does make more sense, even though it is a nerf. Now, there are some tweaks to the class mastery scripts as well, so this will be something to keep in mind. They increased the resources restored from the Nightblade class mastery script up to 400. They increased the resources from the Warden class mastery script up to 1435. They did fix an issue with that same Warden script, didn't display a telegraph, and fix some typos with the Dragon Knight class scripts. That's fine. Now let's talk about affixes. This is actually a bigger change, I think. So the way that they've done this is that affix durations are more streamlined. So major buffs and debuff affixes will last for 10 seconds, and minor buffs and debuffs will last for 20 seconds. So this is pretty much like across the board for Scribing. For example, Trample's Major Savagery and Prophecy now lasts 10 seconds. Though this is interesting, Trample's Minor Heroism and Minor Expedition have been changed to Major Heroism and Major Expedition. That's since they are technically only applied to the caster, so it's like a single target buff. Now, of course, they're going to last for 10 seconds rather than 20 seconds since they are major buffs. I've honestly been having trouble finding a use for Trample in my builds. This might make it a little bit more beneficial, maybe for a solo build, for example, because you can get Major Heroism and Major Expedition for 10 seconds, but the fact that it still has that cast time, I don't know. Let me know in the comment section if you found a use for this skill. So then going on with that, Elemental Explosion, Major Savagery and Prophecy now lasts 10 seconds. Same thing for Traveling Knife. Same thing for Vault. Shield Throw, Minor Enervation now lasts 20 seconds. And Minder's Bond affixes remain at 10 seconds upon application since they apply each tick from a 12-second durability. And they say this technically allows a maximum uptime of 22 seconds rather than 20, which they're leaving as is for now, since tethers are a little bit more volatile than normal abilities. But that is it for the Scribing changes. I think, overall they're pretty decent. The big thing this patch, obviously, is going to be the Necromancer changes, the sort of reorganizing of the Nightblade skill lines. Those are pretty big changes overall. So if that affects you, I'd be curious to know what you think. Again, down in the comment section below, let us know. Otherwise, thanks again for watching, and I will see you around in the next video.